Mueller said he left that meeting bound and determined to change the FBI's culture, and that's a word he used, from that of a law enforcement agency to the culture of intelligence. Now, some people could make an argument after September 11th there might have been a need for some of that, but it had bad consequences, terribly bad consequences that bear evil fruit down the road.
What happened yesterday, what has been happening, seems, to use the cliche, surreal. You think, I've always known that there was corruption. I've always known that there are bad actors, there's bad cops. There's all kinds that we've always had sin and human frailty. But it seems to have gone to a level that most of us wouldn't think it could have in America. And so I just, before we get into the book in detail, The Fall of the FBI, just any initial thoughts on what happened yesterday or what's been happening recently?
Well, what happened yesterday, and you're referring specifically to the pleading of Trump after his indictment, it's a tragic day in our history. Everybody says that. It sounds like a cliche. What makes it difficult, from my perspective, where I was trying to examine and point out what's gone wrong with the FBI, specifically and more broadly the whole system of justice, what makes it difficult is, frankly, Trump himself. Some of this stuff he walked into.
Yeah.
But having said that, there's several things wrong with the current situation. There's always been what we call in the United States of America, in the justice system, prosecutorial discretion. That means the prosecutors don't always have to come down with a big hammer. Lesser things happen. With this particular whole episode of these documents, and as I said, Trump sometimes makes it difficult to defend him.
Right.
It still baffles me why he had the documents there and why he behaved as he did with them. Having said that, the initial action of the FBI was definitely an overreach, definitely an abuse. And I'm talking about executing a search warrant at his residence and searching it in that fashion. They should have continued negotiations. The government, should have continued negotiations. They could have used a subpoena. They could have used less intrusive means than a search warrant. That was the first thing that bothered me about this. It turns out now what some of us suspected all along. The agent in charge of Washington field office at that time, who had the investigation, it was being run out of the Washington field office, objected to the idea of a search warrant. He asked questions and got very bad answers. He testified to this last Friday in the House of Representatives. He asked, who's the assistant attorney in the Southern District of Florida that we should be coordinating with? He was told, we're not involving the Southern District of Florida. We're not involving the Miami office of the FBI. This is all being run out of Maine DOJ. And as he said to Congress on Friday, they didn't learn the lessons of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. That's the investigation of the Trump campaign, where one of the main errors operationally was it was all run from headquarters without input from the field. That's the first thing that bothered me about this.
Well, when you say from headquarters, that's, to my mind, that's the narrative, is that you've got folks at the top who have politicized things, because you hear this over and over. Well, you know what? The agents on the ground, the agents in the field, they're the same as they ever were. But somehow the folks at the top have gotten so politicized that they aren't interested in the facts from the field or whatever. They have a narrative and they want to get it done, and they're going to do what they need to do, which to most Americans is a scary thing. It's an accrual of power.
Yes, and I make this point in the book, and I'll make this point to you now. A lot of these things that happened in the last few days go back to the original era, the original point of the Bureau getting off track under Bob Mueller, when he was Bob Mueller of special counsel fame, when he was director. He pulled in the September 11th investigations into headquarters, ran it out of headquarters, even though the veteran agents were telling him this is not the way we do things. Then his handpicked successor, James Comey, probably the worst director the FBI ever had.
Also a bum, because I want to be technical. Go ahead.
Okay. He continued in the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then Crossfire Hurricane, the Russian collusion investigation, to run it from headquarters. Comey was, in my assessment, the worst director and the FBI ever had, and he did the most damage to the FBI and its reputation, far greater than J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover had almost half a century to commit some errors. Comey did his damage in a couple of years, and his damage was fundamental. He set a standard. For example, when he stood up, usurped the role of the United States Attorney or the Attorney General, either one, stood up and pardoned, effectively, Hillary Clinton in an email investigation. Now, maybe at the end of the day, she should not have been prosecuted, but it wasn't his role to do that, and he stood up and did that in his arrogance. He set a lot of bad standards. He was a very arrogant person. One little telling thing in there, which is not as bad as the things you're referencing or I'm referencing now about him, that I learned from several people at the meeting, when Bob Mueller, the outgoing director, was at a meeting of the Senior Executive Conference of the FBI, which is like the 12 or 14 assistant directors sitting around a table together, and he told them that Comey's definitely going to be the guy. And then he told them, jokingly, in a jocular fashion, that Comey had some initial hesitation, because at the time, remember, Comey was the Deputy Attorney General. And Comey said to Mueller, "I'd love to run the Bureau, but it'd be a step down for me from Deputy Attorney General." And Comey explained to the executive conference, "No, I drew on a napkin for him that the Director of the FBI reports directly to the Attorney General, bypassing the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General." And only when he saw that napkin did he say, "Oh yeah, I'll take the job." And of course, Mueller laughed, and the people around the room laughed. But that shows you the arrogance of the guy,
you can
the
show
pride.
the arrogance on a napkin. You could just a quick diagram to illustrate arrogance. Arrogance is a scary thing. It's pride, ladies and gentlemen, in case you want another shorter version of the word, pride, arrogance, hubris. That is what the founders tried to create in giving us a government with checks and balances, because they knew that human nature is to do that. And you can understand how somebody like Hoover, who creates something and then oversees it for 40 years, how he would slowly become arrogant or somehow power hungry, whatever you want to say. But the idea that Mueller would have been there so quickly and still carries himself with an air of superciliousness, it looks like to me. I want to read a quote. Molly Hemingway is a friend, has been on the program many times, and she wrote an endorsement of the book I'm holding in my hand as I speak to the author Thomas Baker, The Fall of the FBI. Molly Hemingway says, "The failures and political corruption of the FBI have become undeniable in recent years. The incredible insight from Thomas Baker's 33-year career at the Bureau and his eye-opening reporting make The Fall of the FBI a book only he could have written. It's essential reading for the rest of us who want to know what went wrong and wonder if the FBI can be saved." On my Twitter account, I routinely put hashtag defund the FBI, not merely to be provocative, but sometimes I'm just so astonished at what has happened to some of these agencies that I think you got to start from the beginning. To drain the swamp, you got to drain the swamp. And I hope and pray that Trump has been used and abused enough that if he gets back in, which I think he will, he would take this seriously, because I don't know how you move forward at this moment.
Well, it's a fantastic, a tremendous challenge. I have asserted, and I assert in the book, that the culture has to be changed. The damage Mueller did and Comey in deliberately changing the FBI culture. The FBI had always had a culture of a law enforcement mentality. And when you're in law enforcement, if you're doing things right, you live every day for the day that when the day comes that you have to stand up in court, raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's very different than an intelligence culture, which is how Mueller changed the FBI.
We're going to talk more about this. The book is The Fall of the FBI. Thomas J. Baker, stick around. Welcome back, talking to Thomas J. Baker. The book is The Fall of the FBI. You were just talking about how the culture of the FBI was once what it was, but then it became infected by the intelligence agency culture. How did that happen? Who oversaw that?
It was started with Mueller. Mueller was made the FBI, Bob Mueller of special counsel fame, was made the FBI director only a few days before the September 11th attacks, which happened on a Tuesday. That Saturday morning, he was summoned to Camp David by President George W. Bush, he thought, to give a report of the FBI's investigation. So essentially, there were about 3.5 days between that Tuesday attack and that Saturday morning. Mueller gave the report, and the report was absolutely outstanding. In these 3.5 days, the FBI had done what it does best, investigate. And they had identified all 19 hijackers, their financing, their travel, their associates, their connections back to al-Qaeda. And when he was finished with this report, he expected, and he's told us this, he expected praise and thanks. Instead, George W. Bush looked at him and said, "I don't care about that. I only want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." Later that morning, George Tenet of the CIA presented a plan of action going forward. Bush, when he was done talking, Bush said, "That's great." He turned and faced Comey and said,
Comey.
Excuse me, he turned and faced Mueller.
Mueller.
I misspoke. He turned and faced Bob Mueller and he said, "That's what I want to hear." Mueller said he left that meeting bound and determined to change the FBI's culture, and that's a word he used, from that of a law enforcement agency to the culture of intelligence. Now, some people could make an argument after September 11th, there might have been a need for some of that, but it had bad consequences, terribly bad consequences that bad evil fruit down the road.
Well, this is always the way it works, right? In other words, when you have a crisis, that's the opportunity for everybody to go throw all the rules out. But usually that ends poorly, because the reason you have the rules is for when there's a crisis, you say, well, this is the book that we follow. We got to be very careful. We can't change the Constitution. We can't change. This is why we have these rules. And when somebody becomes consumed with fear or with their own legacy or with their own, whatever it was, whatever deadly cocktail that got George Bush out over his skis, that's what leads to this kind of thing. So, but it is extraordinary, because you can understand, well, there's some wisdom in this idea that we need to be investigating, we need to be involved in this kind of stuff, but it somehow raises the specter of al-Qaeda and this threat. It wipes everything else out, and that's where you get the Patriot Act. That's where you get all kinds of things, because you say, well, we're in an emergency, just like happened with COVID. It's like, we're going to throw rules out. The government's going to have way more power than they ought to have, and it never goes well.
Eric, you're exactly right, and that's a good. You're exactly right. One of the things that I believe has to happen is the culture of the FBI has to be restored. Unfortunately, each time one of these bad things comes to light, whether it's the actions of the people in Crossfire Hurricane, Comey, McCabe, Strzok, other incidents since then, the gymnast case, the deep sixing of the Hunter Biden investigation, all of these things, the current management of the FBI, Director Wray, he says, well, we got rid of those people. They were fired, or they were allowed to walk out the door. And they're refusing to look at that there's a cultural problem. It's not just a few rotten apples.
Yeah.
The FBI and any human organization, in corporate, government, whatever, always has a few rotten apples. But that's not the case now with the FBI. It's beyond rotten apples. It's a rotten culture, and the culture has to be converted.
Well, yeah. I mean, Wray should be forced to walk the plank, preferably 10 times. I cannot imagine how folks like this, I mean, when you talk about the overlooking of the Hunter Biden laptop, it doesn't get bigger than that. Whenever people compare corruption to Watergate, I think Watergate is a joke. Watergate is a molehill compared to these mountains. There's nothing to compare with this level of corruption and power, frankly. The power to take something that big and to bury it, or to say we're effectively going to bury it.
Eric, you're absolutely right. And even before we get to the Hunter Biden and all the Biden matters, the recent, only about 4 weeks ago now, a report from John Durham, the special prosecutor, his report, when anybody takes the time to read that 300-plus page report, you realize that Russian collusion investigation, the sham that it was bigger than Watergate. There was absolutely no reason to begin that investigation. Durham makes that clear. And that certainly alone was bigger than Watergate. Now you have deliberate, and they let one guy walk out the door in Washington Field over this, deliberate deep-sixing of the I'll call it Hunter Biden at this point, the information from the laptop. But now we know that there's more information, thanks to the House of Representatives, there's more information about the Bidens coming forward, tangible information about well over 100 suspicious activity reports, money transfers between banks ending up in a number of the members of the Biden family. And yet that is getting so little attention, not only by the FBI, but even by the general press.
Well, again, you're talking about things that this is why, even to mention Watergate, Watergate is the common cold compared to the bubonic plague that we're talking about. This is so much more dramatic, and I think that there's a time you realize that people have just gone nuts. In other words, the media, generally speaking, the culture of Washington, these people are somehow so convinced that Donald Trump is evil and a threat to democracy that they will do anything. Every rule has been thrown out the window. They don't care how they win. All they care about is winning. And that is the end of America. You cannot have the United States of America on the founders' vision if you do not care about the founding principles. And these folks, if they're familiar with the founding principles, they've thrown them away. And we're at a moment like we've never been in before.
You mentioned first principles, Eric, in the last segment. And that's what the FBI has to get back to. And to me, that means the U.S. Constitution. And in our training years ago as special agents, that had primacy. That was central. When we went through new agents training, all of our classroom work was around the Constitution. We went out to the field to Quantico for firearms training and things like that. But in the classroom for almost 3 months, it was the Constitution. We had wonderful agent instructors, agent attorneys who were our instructors. And they taught us the Bill of Rights, and they taught us specifically the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. And they said to us, and some people find this shocking, I've had defense attorneys can't believe it when I tell them this, that a law enforcement agency trained like this. These instructors told us that the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment to the Constitution we should not view as an obstacle to getting our job done. We should embrace them. And later, when we finished, they gave each of us a pocket copy of the Constitution. And this one instructor, I remember, he said, and he called us boys because we were all men then, he said, keep the pocket copy of the Constitution in your breast pocket. And when you're out there interviewing a citizen or searching somebody's home, if the Constitution is in your pocket, it's very unlikely that you'll ever go off the rails, that you'll ever do something out of order. Now, that sounds corny to some people today, but that's how we were trained, and that's how most of us behave.
Hey, if it sounds corny to you, you're part of the problem, ladies and gentlemen, because that's how far we've come. When you had that kind of respect for this thing we call law, the Constitution.
Yes.
I mean, that I got to tell you, I get choked up listening to you tell that story.
Well, and that is why I wrote this book, but I feel heartbroken thinking about what's become of the FBI today.
Well, you're talking about the late 70s. You're talking about an era where we had already seen the denigration of the Constitution through a Supreme Court that had already drifted from originalism. So, the seeds of these things they're there for a long time. It's taken a long, long time. But we know that when you were a young man, the FBI still understood the primacy, that we're a nation of laws, and we take that extremely seriously because we understand we have nothing else. We're sawing the branch that we're sitting on if we don't take that seriously. But the idea that he would tell you to keep the Constitution in your pocket, that is amazing. Do you tell that story in the book?
Absolutely. That's key.
Just got a minute left. Thomas Baker, final thoughts.
Final thoughts is this is not a problem of a few bad individuals, a few bad apples. The culture of the FBI has to change. That has to come from within the FBI. There is a role for Congress. They do have the threat of a budget. They also have, they're re-upping, and they will have opportunities again to re-up parts of the FISA Act. The FISA Act was abused in this whole story, and that's something that can be changed, restoring FISA to its original purpose of surveilling foreign agents, not U.S. citizens. That's key, too.